Lieutenant Jackson Cole stood in the hallway of the Coalition Command Dome, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Behind the sleek, reinforced blast doors, the War Council was already in session. The oval seal of the Intergalactic Coalition shimmered faintly on the glass-like surface, rotating slowly, as if mocking his exclusion. Through the small observation strip above the doorframe, he could see the silhouettes of various species, towering Draxons with their plated skulls, nimble-armed Yalari scribbling tactical simulations into the air, and the ever-rigid Talaxian generals seated like cold statues carved from ice. It was a parade of intellect, ego, and politics, and none of it included him. He had been briefed the day before, briefed, but not invited. Captain Resson, a long-necked Dralathi officer whose tone always carried the perfume of condescension, had called it a strategic omission. The exact words still rang in Jackson's head. "Your combat record is impressive, Lieutenant, but council meetings require discipline, strategic foresight. We can't afford improvisation at this level." Discipline. That word had followed Jackson since the academy, whispered with suspicion by those who'd never fought on the dirt, under fire, where plans crumbled like sandcastles and survival depended on decisions made in seconds. His improvisation had saved dozens of lives in the Battle of Kepler Verge. His quick, unsanctioned maneuver through the asteroid field of Sector B11 had ended a pirate siege in under an hour. But up here, on Cygnus 4, where the corridors smelled of sterilized air and every order passed through 6 layers of approval, his instincts were unwelcome. The council chamber's interior lights flickered subtly, another signal that the AI had sealed the room. Once closed, the doors wouldn't open again until the council recessed. Jackson stared a moment longer, then turned without a word. His boots echoed against the metallic floor as he walked down the silent hall, past the motionless holograms of honored war heroes, past guards who didn't even glance his way. He wasn't a threat, just a human officer with a tendency to move before being told. Outside the dome, Cygnus 4's thin atmosphere painted the sky a pale green, a color Jackson still hadn't gotten used to. The military compound stood on a cliff's edge overlooking a vast expanse of dry ridges and electro-sand valleys. The enemy, an insurgent faction of the Arakan species, had taken control of 3 outposts in the sector and were advancing toward Base Helix, the communications hub of the region. The coalition had lost 3 patrols trying to slow them down. Now, the council was discussing whether to hold the line at Helix or retreat to the inner ridges and call for reinforcements. Jackson already knew what the council would do. They would debate for hours, weigh risks, consult simulations, and by the time they reached consensus, the enemy would have already breached the perimeter. The Arakan weren't methodical, they were ruthless, impulsive, and fast. That's why Jackson respected them, even as he planned to break them. He made his way to the hangar without checking in. He didn't need authorization to access his own gear, and if anyone questioned him later, he'd claim he was just inspecting readiness. He passed rows of parked transports and cargo loaders until he reached a small recon vehicle tucked in the back, an aging but reliable Terra Rover 12, a model humans had designed for terrain the Coalition had once deemed untraversable. He climbed in, booted up the system, and manually disabled the onboard transponder. No need for command to track a soldier they hadn't invited to their party. In the back compartment, he packed what he needed: a scoped kinetic rifle, 3 EMP grenades, a hand-modified drone fitted with jamming tech, and a collapsible comms booster he'd built during his first deployment. Most of it wasn't standard issue. Most of it wasn't even legal by Coalition regs. But it worked, and that was all that mattered. Jackson sat for a moment in the cockpit, staring at the empty passenger seat. He could have asked for backup. Technically, he could have requested permission to run recon, but he knew the answer. No time, no approval, no patience for cowboy tactics, as Resson liked to say. He started the engine. The hum of the rover vibrated under his feet. With one sharp turn, He drove out of the hangar, past checkpoint sensors, and into the open terrain. No one tried to stop him. No alarms sounded. As far as the base was concerned, Lieutenant Jackson Cole didn't need to be monitored, because he didn't matter. The desert-like plain opened up before him, the ridges shimmering with residual heat. He adjusted the rover's shield frequency, shifting it to reduce his visibility on enemy sensors. The terrain was unpredictable, cracks in the earth from tectonic tension, magnetic storms that flared with no warning. But Jackson had studied this sector for weeks. He'd already predicted the most likely route the Iraqi forces would take. If he reached the southern pass before nightfall, he could scout their forward unit before they repositioned. If he acted quickly, very quickly, he might even stop them. The Coalition Council would still be deliberating, carefully planning their defense, running probability matrices and testing containment models. They'd never suspect that one man, one uninvited human, was already in the field, already hunting. He glanced at his wrist interface. A pulsing red dot appeared, far ahead, approaching the projected entry corridor. Enemy movement confirmed. Jackson exhaled slowly. His hands tightened on the steering controls. He wasn't part of the Strategy Council. Good. He didn't need their permission to win a war. He just needed a head start. The southern pass loomed ahead like a jagged wound across the cracked landscape, a stretch of narrow ridges and sand troughs framed by cliffs streaked in rust-colored mineral veins. Jackson Cole adjusted the rover's trajectory, skirting a rocky ledge that overlooked the pass from the west. His visor display mapped out the terrain in thin blue lines, overlaying known topography with projected enemy routes. The red pulse marking Iraqi movement blinked steadily now, closer than before, steady in direction, deliberate in pace. He parked the rover under a ridge outcrop, camouflaged it with its heat-dampening tarp, and killed the power feed. A breeze scraped across the dust, carrying the sharp scent of oxidized metal and the faint static of an approaching weather shift. The sky above had begun to dim into violet streaks, evening pulling over Cygnus 4 like a warning. Jackson moved quickly, locking his helmet and slinging his rifle across his shoulder. He grabbed the drone case, opened it, and powered up the compact unit. It floated up, blinking green once, then cloaking in near invisibility as its stealth field activated. He crouched behind a boulder, linked into the drone's visual stream, and directed it down into the canyon. The feed was choppy at first, terrain interference, but stabilized as the drone climbed and then dipped into a smoother pocket of air. Jackson leaned closer into the view, watching. The Iraqi convoy had arrived. Through the grainy, zoomed lens, he counted at least 4 treaded transports, each armed with twin plasma turrets. Between them, dozens of infantry moved in precision, forming a perimeter as engineers disembarked to scan the rocks and scan for mines. Their armor bore the jagged sigils of the Sectal Division, ruthless shock troops who hadn't lost a battle in over 4 years. He'd heard the rumors, even read the incident reports. The Sectal didn't just conquer, they erased. A normal scout would have returned at that point, logged the sighting, requested orders, waited for authorization. Jackson closed the drone feed, tapped a sequence on his wrist pad, and triggered the scanning overlay. A topographic simulation sprang up in translucent red above his forearm. He rotated the projection, zooming in on the rock formations above the path. The enemy had stopped beneath a natural choke point, narrow cliffs with loose basalt ridges. Unstable, dry, brittle, perfect. He reached into his pack and pulled out one of the EMP charges. These weren't standard issue explosives. He'd modified them months ago using surplus grav coils and pulse capacitors scrounged from busted recon bikes. When placed near a fault line, the energy didn't just disrupt electronics, it created shockwaves. He'd never tested one on this scale, but this wasn't a training run. This was necessity wrapped in instinct. Keeping low, he scaled the incline above the convoy. His fingers dug into the dusty rock, each foothold a small, calculated risk. No safety rope, no backup, just his breath, his grip, and the ticking voice of logic in his head. Climb fast, plant faster, disappear. He reached the upper ridge in minutes. Below, the convoy began to unload heavier equipment. A commander emerged, bigger than the others, draped in segmented silver plating with a jagged black crest running down his back. Jackson marked the figure. If the collapse didn't get him, the fallout would. He attached the EMP to a cluster of unstable rock and calibrated the detonation timer for 2 minutes. Not instant. That would draw attention before he could vanish, but just enough delay to leave doubt, chaos, hesitation. He turned, climbed down the opposite side, and activated the second charge as he descended. He left no markers, no traces, just shifting dust behind his boots. He circled back to his rover, re-entered the cockpit, and linked into the drone one last time. The feed returned, centered on the convoy. 1 minute left. The Iraqan troops had formed tighter ranks. The engineers seemed confused. One of the transports was reporting sensor interference. The commander waved them off with a heavy hand. No real alarm. Not yet. 30 seconds. Jackson kept his finger near the jammer trigger. The instant the explosion started, he'd activate the signal disruption to compound the chaos. A silent hammer followed by an electronic scream. 10. He braced his hand on the rover's console, counting under his breath. 3, 2, 1. The upper ridge buckled. What began as a slight tremble became a violent roar. The cliffside fractured along the implanted fault, and hundreds of tons of blackened stone rained down like a judgment. One of the plasma transports was crushed instantly. A second managed to reverse, but not fast enough. Dust blanketed the pass in a choking wave. Figures scattered. Voices shouted. A siren wailed, then died as the first charge's pulse fried nearby equipment. Jackson flicked the jammer on. The signal cascade surged into the air like a scream, bouncing off rocks and echoing through the dust field. Enemy comms would now be blind, scrambled into static. Orders couldn't be issued. Ranks would split. Discipline would fracture. He grabbed the rifle and stepped out of the rover. The real work was about to begin. The battlefield below was no longer coordinated. It was scattered, confused, and frightened. Perfect. Jackson took aim at the first figure who rose from the rubble. One shot, clean, silent, and final. He moved to a new position, circling wide around the cliff. From above, the Iraqan couldn't triangulate him. Each shot he fired came from a new angle, every impact deepening the sense of being hunted. He didn't need to wipe them all out. He just needed to turn them against each other. He tossed one of the EMP grenades toward the rear ranks. It detonated in a flash of violet light, frying a comms pack and causing 2 Iraqan units to scream in confusion. One turned on the other, shouting, until another dust blast blinded them both. By the time Jackson returned to the rover, he'd counted 14 dead, 3 transports disabled, and no clear command structure left. He climbed back into the seat, heart pounding but steady. He wasn't smiling. He didn't need to. His objective was simple: destabilize the convoy before it reached base helix. Judging by the chaos unfolding through his drone's final images, that objective was complete. The Council would still be debating defensive placements, sensor upgrades, and political implications. Meanwhile, the enemy wasn't advancing anymore. Jackson turned the rover toward the next ridge and accelerated. He had one more position to hit before sunrise. No meetings, no permissions, just movement, just progress, just war, his way. The eastern rise was jagged, littered with obsidian shards that crunched under Jackson's boots as he reached the summit. The wind cut through the air like a blade, carrying the scent of scorched metal and ionized dust. His visor filtered most of it, but the taste still lingered faintly on his tongue. Battle had been here, recently and violently. The sun of Cygnus IV had dipped below the far ridgeline, casting long purple shadows across the barren field. He crouched and brought up his scope, scanning the ruins of what had once been a mobile Iraqan forward command unit. Smoke drifted in lazy tendrils from collapsed structures and the half-buried wreckage of what had been their final working transport. Jackson watched the scene carefully, noting how the remaining Iraqan had retreated deeper into the canyon. clustering into 3 defensive pockets. Each pocket was isolated, their lines of communication severed, their heavy weapons lost or buried. From above, they looked like wounded creatures circling their own blood. Jackson wasn't interested in annihilation. What he needed was confusion. The more fractured the enemy became, the less likely a secondary wave would be sent to reinforce them. He tapped the side of his helmet, opening a local channel to his drone. The feed lit up again, showing thermal traces. The survivors were burning power trying to reactivate comms equipment. 2 units had begun hand signal coordination, primitive for Irakan, a species that prided itself on neural link protocols. That pride was now working against them. He activated his second drone, smaller than the first, barely larger than his hand. It lifted into the air and zipped toward the southern edge of the canyon, silent as ash. Jackson followed on foot, staying behind rocks and moving with practiced rhythm. Step, pause, listen, breathe. The enemy was still off balance, but time was bleeding fast. If any of their technicians managed to bypass the jammer field, they could relay distress signals. If a beacon broke through to the main Irakan fleet, Jackson's disruption wouldn't matter. The reinforcements would come, and base Helix would fall by numbers alone. He reached a narrow crack in the cliffside and squeezed through, boots scraping the stone. The path descended into a hidden overlook, a place he'd noted weeks ago while reviewing outdated mineral scans. Below him, 3 Irakan engineers were struggling to realign a collapsed comms mast. The base of the structure sparked weakly, arcs of light crackling as they tried to reroute power. Jackson leveled his rifle. He didn't fire. Instead, he tapped his wrist pad, opened the drone's auditory interface, and fed in an audio loop he'd captured earlier. Irakan officer barks, command codes, threat warnings. The drone projected the sound in full volume from the opposite ridge. The engineers reacted immediately. 2 dropped tools and drew sidearms, backing toward the shadows. The third panicked and fired at the echo, unloading his weapon into nothing. Within seconds, more Irakan converged on the sound, guns raised, nerves high-strung. Jackson watched as one misidentified a shape and fired. Another shouted. The formation collapsed into panic again. He didn't need to shoot to cause damage. Their fear was doing that for him. He slipped down the incline, crouched low, and circled behind the outcrop. His goal now was the comms beacon, not to destroy it, but to hijack it. He reached the panel, kicked open the access hatch, and connected his booster module directly into the uplink slot. A blue light pulsed 3 times. His interface opened, displaying an encrypted Irakan network map, unstable but intact. He keyed in a falsified transmission, retreat order, immediate fallback to rally point Theta 7, high command recall protocol. The message would look real, sound real, and it would be received by anyone still monitoring Irakan channels nearby. He disengaged and pulled back into the rocks as the signal burst through the remaining dust. Seconds passed. Then the first Irakan commander screamed something in confirmation. Others began shouting. Troops moved, not away from him, but away from Helix. His bluff had landed. He exhaled slowly, heart steady, eyes sharp. Behind him, the secondary canyon lit up with flashes, internal explosives being triggered on damaged equipment. The Irakan never left tech behind, unless ordered. The retreat was now real, even if it had started as a lie. Jackson didn't linger to watch the chaos unfold. He sprinted back to the rover, checked his sat map, and recalibrated his next route. The last objective was an artillery nest rumored to be embedded deep in the northern hills. If it wasn't neutralized, it could pound the base from a distance and undo everything he'd just accomplished. The rover groaned as it lifted off the plateau, kicking dust into the air. Jackson didn't look back. He adjusted his comm unit to monitor open coalition channels. The War Council's signal was still active, voices layered atop one another, orders, simulations, projections. One general argued about shield placements, another about diplomatic backlash. None of them had noticed yet. None had seen the new thermal voids appearing on the enemy maps. None had questioned why the Iraqan numbers had dropped by half in less than an hour, but they would, and when they did, they'd have to admit what Jackson already knew. Decisions made in silence, on the ground, moved faster than any table of generals. He drove harder into the storm gathering ahead. The clouds flashed with distant lightning, and the terrain began to rise into knife-edged hills. There was no backup, there was no confirmation, just purpose and motion, and that was enough. The storm swallowed the hills in ash-colored mist. Flashes of distant lightning tore across the sky, illuminating jagged peaks like bones under stretched skin. The rover climbed steadily, tires biting into unstable ground, its shield generator flickering under the strain of electromagnetic pulses swirling in the air. Jackson leaned forward, eyes narrowed behind his visor, reading the terrain through bursts of static as the vehicle rocked over ridges and narrow passes. He had one target left, the last artillery nest. If left intact, it could lob plasma shells into base helix for hours without retaliation. Coalition targeting systems would be forced to waste energy shielding infrastructure instead of troops. All the confusion he had sown would be for nothing if the enemy still had a hammer to swing. He parked beneath a natural stone bridge, shut off the engine, and waited. His breath filled the helmet like a low drumbeat. No sound came from beyond the glass, only the heavy hum of the wind and the occasional rumble of thunder trapped between peaks. Jackson stepped out, knees flexed, rifle in hand. The air was sharp with ozone. He crouched low and scaled a side path that wound like a scar along the cliff face. The higher he climbed, the colder it became. The dust turned to glassy frost under his gloves. Every stone echoed. Every misplaced bootstep risked giving away his approach. The nest came into view near the summit, dug into the rock, low and wide, hidden by a veil of camouflaged metal netting. One long-barreled plasma thrower was already locked in standby mode, aimed directly south toward Helix. Two auxiliary cannons lay half-buried under tarp, and the heat signatures of the power cores pulsed steadily through Jackson's scanner. Only 4 Iraqan soldiers remained, posted in a loose perimeter. They weren't expecting contact, not up here, not after the chaos that had just burned through the canyon below. Jackson observed in silence. He didn't move for nearly a minute. His eyes followed the rhythm of their patrols, the slope of the terrain, the blind spots in their arc. Then he acted. He moved along the edge of the cliff, slow and deliberate, until he reached the underside of the nest. A maintenance tunnel had been carved into the stone, a narrow gap used for coolant lines and recharging cables. He slipped in without hesitation, crawling until the passage opened beneath the primary generator housing. His hands moved automatically. Wires, magnets, capacitors. The device he placed was small, clumsy-looking, and ugly. But if the timing was right, the chain reaction would send a pulse through the generator coils, overheating the main conduit and frying the control relays. The result wouldn't be explosive. It would be surgical, silent. He activated the delay and pulled out the second part of the plan, a signal beacon coded with Iraqan distress tones. He set it on the floor near the north wall and tuned it to broadcast in 10 seconds. Jackson backed out of the tunnel and took position behind an outcropping. He raised his scope, waited. The beacon lit. The Iraqan guards immediately reacted. One turned toward the false source, hand raised in signal. Another ran forward to investigate. In the scramble, no one noticed the soft hum beneath their feet as the generator began to spike. 5 seconds later, the nest's lights flickered, and a thin jet of steam hissed from the ventilation slots. The commander barked a warning, but it was too late. The entire housing unit shorted out in a flash of light. No explosion, no fire, just a clean power failure. The plasma thrower dimmed and folded in on itself. The auxiliary cannons stuttered, cycled once, and shut down. Panic followed, not because of an attack, but because there was no explanation, no trace, no signal of intrusion. For a moment, the Iraqan guards simply stood there, staring at the inert weapons, Unable to process what had gone wrong, Jackson slipped away from the ridge without a word. The climb down was slower. His legs ached. The wind had picked up, howling through the canyons and dragging dust like smoke from a battlefield already fading into memory. He didn't feel triumph. He didn't feel anything yet, only the need to move, to be gone before someone started asking questions about how any of this had happened. He returned to the rover and powered it up again. The dashboard showed faint alerts from coalition frequencies. Static first, then chatter. High Command was waking up to the shifting battlefront. Jackson patched into one of the open observation channels. The voice of a Talaxian war analyst filtered through, low and clipped, speaking rapidly into the command logs. Unexplained withdrawal from Sector 9. Reports of internal sabotage in Iraqi ranks. We're confirming weapon malfunctions across 3 assault columns, unable to match disruption patterns with any known coalition deployment. Another voice interrupted, frustrated, louder, human, possibly one of the junior tacticians assigned to council support. Can someone tell me who authorized a solo strike on the southern ridge? We've got drone footage of collapsed formations and someone's rifle signature all over the wreckage. There was silence for a moment, then static. Jackson shut the feed off. He parked at the edge of the cliff overlooking the battlefield, what remained of it. Smoke still curled from broken ridges and abandoned vehicles. From this distance, the war seemed small, distant, like the dying echoes of a storm that had already passed. He opened the rover's canopy and stepped out. The wind hit him full in the face, dry and harsh, but real. He breathed it in deeply, not for oxygen, but for presence, to know he was still here, still standing. In the valley below, the last of the Iraqi stragglers disappeared over the far ridge, retreating, not defeated by fleet bombardments or diplomatic pressure, but pushed back by one man with no seat at the table. He sat on the edge of the rock, rifle resting beside him, helmet tucked between his knees. The sun was rising again, pale and cold, casting long shadows over the fractured landscape. Somewhere far behind, the council chamber doors would be opening soon. Officers would exit with datapads full of conclusions and reports drafted before reality had caught up. No one inside had heard the collapse. No one had seen the look on the Iraqis' faces when their weapons died in their hands. But someone would ask. Someone would follow the trail back to him. He wasn't sure what the consequences would be. Court-martial, commendation, maybe both. He didn't care. The storm was over. The battlefield was silent. And for now, that was enough. Jackson Cole entered the Coalition Command Dome the next morning without being stopped. No clearance badge was scanned. No guard raised a hand to question him. The long corridor leading to the War Council chamber stood open, its lights glowing soft blue, pulsing in rhythm with the heartbeat of the base. The council session was already in progress. He could hear voices echoing through the wide entryway, measured tones, formal diction, calculated language. None of it surprised him. He didn't hesitate. Boots striking polished floor, dust from the cliffs still clinging to his uniform, he crossed the threshold and walked into the chamber without announcement. Conversations broke. Heads turned. Silence spread like a rippling sheet of tension across the room. The high table, shaped like a flattened crescent and lined with shimmering tactical interfaces, stood at the center. Behind it sat the senior representatives of 12 species, their expressions ranging from neutral to alarmed. Captain Resson was the first to rise. His elongated frame stiffened, eyes narrowing with a mix of confusion and poorly veiled irritation. "Lieutenant Cole," he said, voice cool, "this session is closed." Jackson kept walking. He didn't speak, not yet. He walked to the edge of the table and placed a data core down with quiet finality. The surface lit beneath it, auto-recognizing the encryption as Coalition registered, high clearance, verified, uncorrupted. He tapped a key on his wrist pad. The feed from his drone, rover sensors, thermal imaging, and helmet footage activated, playing across the main holo display. Silence deepened. Explosions filled the projection. Terrain deformation mapped in real time, enemy ranks dispersing, artillery going offline, Iraqi commanders issuing fallback orders in panicked bursts. No sound accompanied the footage, only image after image of coordinated collapse. No coalition airstrikes, no supporting squads. One man, alone, striking where it hurt most. Ressen's lips parted, but no words came. General Solith, the Talaxian with pale skin like frozen quartz, leaned forward, folding his long fingers together. "When did this operation commence, Lieutenant?" he asked, voice low and level. Jackson met his eyes. 17 minutes after the strategy session began. Murmurs followed, some astonishment, some disbelief, some quiet admiration too subtle to be spoken aloud in front of the others. "Under whose authority?" Solith asked, though the question had already answered itself. "None," Jackson replied. "Mine." The room shifted. Some bristled, others simply watched. Ressen leaned on the table, voice sharp now. "You violated direct protocol. You left the base without orders. You engaged the enemy without support. You risked strategic exposure and won the engagement before the Council had issued a single order." Jackson interrupted, calm but firm. "You spent 4 hours running simulations. I spent 4 hours disrupting the enemy's command network, disabling their artillery, fracturing their unit cohesion, and forcing retreat. You were still discussing what to name the operation when it was already over." Solith's lips curved, barely. Not quite a smile, but something close. He turned his gaze to the other council members. "Let the record show," he said, "that base helix remains intact. Enemy formations in sectors 7 through 9 have been confirmed neutralized. No civilian casualties, no damage to infrastructure. Coalition casualties, 0. Jackson stood in silence, unmoving. Captain Ressen flared his nostrils but sat back down. He had lost the room, not in volume, but in weight. The weight of action, the weight of results. Admiral Ivrix, a short, scale-skinned leader from the Orjak Empire, finally spoke, voice deep and deliberate. "What do you propose, Lieutenant?" Jackson looked around the table. Every face, alien and human alike, was watching him now, not with hostility, not with blind reverence, but with something new, respect. He stepped forward and placed his palms on the edge of the table. "I propose that you stop treating instinct like a liability," he said, "that you stop dismissing frontline experience in favor of sanitized theory. I didn't act because I wanted glory. I acted because the window was closing, and no one in this room was willing to move without consensus. The enemy doesn't wait for consensus." He paused. "I'm not asking for a medal. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a seat at this table, not to replace anyone, but to ensure that when the next emergency hits, someone here remembers what it looks like on the ground." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Solith stood. He walked to the far corner of the crescent table where a single chair sat unused, designated for rotational guests who never stayed long enough to matter. He turned it, faced it toward the center, and gestured. "Then sit," he said. Jackson blinked once, quietly, then nodded and walked to the seat. He sat down without ceremony, without thanks, and looked straight ahead. The session resumed, but something fundamental had changed. When new data arrived from the northern ridges, the Council deferred to him for tactical interpretation. When new Iraqi troop movements were confirmed near Sector 12, it was his analysis the generals waited for. His voice, once missing entirely from the strategic conversation, now cut through the fog like a blade, clear, unfiltered, grounded in experience. And when the session ended, no one told him to leave. He walked out with the rest of them. The base corridors were quiet again, but this time officers nodded when he passed. A few gave short, wordless glances of approval. He didn't react. He didn't need to. He stepped into the lift, rode it to the upper deck, and stood alone at the viewing window that overlooked the valley below. The battlefield had already been scrubbed clean. The smoke had settled. The silence had returned. But the shift was real. Jackson had not only fought the battle, he had rewritten the terms of who belonged at the table, and from that moment on, no one would forget it, not because he broke protocol, not because he won alone, but because when the council hesitated, he moved, and that was how the war began to change, not with a plan, but with a decision.